Anxiety comes in many shapes and forms, but by far the most prevalent is that which is referred to as generalised anxiety disorder. Now, it also has a far simpler and I think more descriptive title, and that is chronic worrying. Very apt. If you live your life on a day-to-day basis suffering from severe anxiety, then the odds are you're going to be feeling pretty isolated. However, the truth is that the facts speak differently, because up to 1 in 10 people will suffer from a chronic anxiety condition at some stage in their lives. And also in the UK alone, up to 2.5 million people can be suffering from an anxiety-related condition at any one time. So, with these sort of figures, what is it that's making us so anxious? Well, the causes are many and varied, but they can be broken down into a few basic groups. Now, first of all, this could be an inherited disposition for you. It could be genetic. You could have inherited being anxiety prone from your parents. And of course, that does set you off at a disadvantage. But also in childhood, events that happen to us. Some of the major events, for instance, loss of a parent or even separation from parents, and other significant events, and sometimes not so significant events, will occur to us that will have a major impact on us for the rest of our lives, even though frequently we will have forgotten about them altogether, or we think we've forgotten about them. And then, of course, as adults, the stresses and strains of our lives just go on and on and on. We worry about our work, we worry about our relationships, we worry about our finances. And we live in a crowded environment. Our lives are busy, and on a day-to-day basis, we have no time for me time. We can never give ourselves permission to actually come down. And so we live all the time with this sort of high level of anxiety. Now, as a former anxiety sufferer, I know how difficult it is to cope with these things on a day-to-day basis. And we end up in a rather vicious cycle. And one of the downsides of that is that sometimes, as a result of our anxiety, we make very poor lifestyle choices. So, for instance, we may eat too much, we may drink too much, we may smoke too much. And of course, in the long term, certainly, this affects our health and it can affect our mental welfare. Now, there is a part of the brain known as the amygdala, and that is responsible for our emotions. So pleasure, anger, fear, all of those emotions are created in the amygdala. But it also has another role in our life, and that is it retains information, it remembers things. Not only does it remember things that happen to us, the events in our lives, but it also remembers how we felt about it, what our emotions were like. And it relates these things. So when further events happen in our lives, it remembers all this information and it feeds down our sort of responses to those events. And it gives us the emotions that we should be feeling. Now, when you're suffering from anxiety, those emotions are frequently negative. How does this actually work then? How does the brain make these sort of relationships, and why is it feeding this negative information? If I can give you an example, an everyday example about how we relate sort of ideas and thoughts and things that happen to us. It's around midday. I'm upstairs, and all of a sudden from downstairs I can hear the clashing of pots and pans. Now my brain thinks, oh, it's midday, pots and pans must be coming up for lunchtime. That then creates some very nice feelings inside me. I start anticipating lunch, very pleasurable experience for me that's going to be. My gastric juices start to work, and it's all a very positive experience. However, for some of us, it may not be that way. We may interpret those sounds in a totally different way, and they could then trigger the fight or flight mechanism in our minds. Those mechanisms that feed the chemicals and the hormones into our body, which can actually be harmful to us, you know, the adrenaline, the noradrenaline, the cortisol. And it makes us extremely anxious, and we're feeling this constantly. What we need to do is to break that cycle. And we can break that cycle by changing that information that's going into our minds. Now, of course, some of you may well know the causes of your anxiety, or at least with help, you may be able to reveal the underlying cause of your anxiety. For instance, I had a friend who was absolutely terrified of telephones and would not make a telephone call. And even the sound of a phone ringing almost gave her a panic attack. But with help, she actually realised that this actually did relate to something. And it turned out that as a child, she had actually witnessed her mother answering the phone when the phone call was actually to tell her mother about her father's death overseas. She had actually forgotten the specifics of that event, but the emotion stayed with her for the rest of her life. And therefore, when a telephone rang, or she saw a telephone, she had to deal with the telephone, all of that exploded again. Now, obviously, she could be helped to overcome those anxieties. But for many of us, where we're suffering from generalised anxiety disorder, we can't always recognise what the causes are. And sometimes there can be more than one cause. So we have to learn to reinterpret events, or to help our brains to reinterpret events, so that we are not feeding that negative information to our brains constantly, you know, hour after hour, day after day. And I'm going to be talking about this very subject in my later videos, how we can reframe our thoughts, how we can stop ourselves talking to ourselves negatively and putting all this negative information into our minds. Until I get to speak to you again, it has been a pleasure, and please take care.